Welcome to the Judgment Call podcast, a podcast where I bring together some of the most curious minds on the planet. Risk takers, adventurers, travelers, investors, entrepreneurs, and simply mind-bogglers. To find all episodes of this show, simply go to Spotify, iTunes, or YouTube, or go to our website, judgmentcallpodcast.com. If you like this show, please consider leaving a review on iTunes or subscribe to us on YouTube. This episode of the Judgment Call podcast is sponsored by Mighty Travels Premium. Full disclosure, this is my business. What we do at Mighty Travels Premium is to find the airfare deals that you really want. Thousands of subscribers have saved up to 95% in their airfare. Those include $150 round-trip tickets to Hawaii from many cities in the US, or $600 lie-flat tickets in business class from the US to Asia, or $100 business class lie-flat tickets from Africa round-trip all the way to Asia. In case you didn't know, about half the world is open for business again and accepts travelers. Most of those countries are in South America, Africa, and Eastern Europe. To try out Mighty Travels Premium, go to mightytravels.com/MTP, or if that's too many letters for you, simply go to MTP, the number 4, and the letter U.com to sign up for your 30-day free trial. Patricia, I want to take a step back and introduce you really briefly. You're one of the foremost experts on the history of science, especially of the Enlightenment and in Europe, and you teach at Cambridge. And you wrote almost a dozen books, including Science, a 4,000-year history, and your latest book is called Isaac Newton's World Career at the Mint, about his later years. And I wanted to ask you about when you studied, especially this really long history of 4,000 years, that's a ton of knowledge you have to absorb, I assume, and tons of facts you have to look into. When you remember back when you wrote this book a couple of years ago, what was kind of the most surprising thing you felt was, wow, I really did not expect it. I didn't know that this is happened during the 4,000 years. What is kind of this pattern that emerged for you, but you never thought that's actually going to happen before you wrote this book?
I think the most important thing for me when I was writing the book was to determine a structure, because otherwise I thought back and there were all sorts of things happening all over the place and all over the world, and I felt I needed to impose some sort of pattern on it. And what I did not want to do was to tell a straightforward story of progress leading to the present, because I think scientific development is a branching, random process, and I also wanted to make it not just a story about the supremacy of European thought. I wanted to also to write about other cultures and the knowledge that they've acquired. So when I decided to structure it as 7 sections of 7 chapters each, it surprised me that having invented that completely artificial, in a way, arbitrary structure, it enabled me to link things together in different ways. So, for example, one of the sections, it focuses on small things. So I would put genes and atoms bracketed together, which is not what usually happens. Usually one of them is in biology and then atoms are in particle physics. So having that structure made me think about the history of science in a very different way, because of course there's no right or wrong way to tell a story about the past. Even my starting point 4,000 years ago, that was arbitrary. I chose the Babylonians because their choice of 60 as the base unit still affects us because of the seconds in a minute, the minutes in an hour, and 360 degrees in a circle. So that was where I decided to start. But of course I could have started earlier, with several thousand years earlier, with Stonehenge, for example.
Did you feel there is some super conscious direction of science? So I know you thought about how science is based on economics, but it also is very strongly interrelated with religion. And we have these constant wars that seems to be influenced by science, for the better or worse. Do you think there is some like cosmic direction for science and for technology, or it is completely random and has this up and down cycles?
I don't think there's any direction at all, and I don't really think there is such a single thing as science. If you look at what drives people is the search for money, the search for domination, the search for land, if you happen to be a government. And scientific knowledge is usually a byproduct of that. There's this great ideological model that you have a scientist who's somehow above worldly concerns. He, because it usually is a he, has got this abstract mind that's sort of somehow floating around, and it's very different from everybody else's. It seems to me that's just a secular equivalent of a saint. A saint is a very special person who's divorced from the rest of humanity, is above the rest of humanity. And it seems to me that scientists have taken over that social role of saints, and we regard them as being different. But in fact, scientists are just as much immersed in the interests of the world, in commercial interests, in interests for their own promotion. They're just as much concerned with those as anybody else is. So the drive to explore the world, for example, to go to America, well, wasn't so much, well, I wonder what America looks like. It was much more, well, perhaps there's going to be all sorts of rare metals and woods and plants and other products that we can bring back from America that will benefit us. That was why people went there and started exploring it, but not because they had some abstract notion that they'd like to know more about it.
Well, there seems to be this human desire for human recognition, right? And in order to be widely recognized, you want to possess something, knowledge or relationship that other people are interested in, right? That they crave. Mm. And we notice from priests there, we notice about the monasteries, right? They got really popular in the Middle Ages because priests and the monks there, they were close to God, and everyone was seeking that closeness, either because of redemption or have a way to repent sins. Mm. So they used that leverage over time to obviously enrich themselves because it was a tradable value that they found in society. And I feel when we look at how modern physicists, for instance, appear in modern media, they're kind of like priests, as you say, right? They are close to God. They're close into to knowing how the world is really made of, and they kind of use this as leverage in society, I feel, obviously to get human recognition, but also to make money and enjoy the benefits of it. I think this is great, right? So this is what entrepreneurs do too. It's kind of a reality distortion field. But in order to keep this alive, you constantly have to come up with something new, right? Something that is relevant and other people actually also want.
I think one argument about the church is that the medieval churches were the very foundation of capitalism. If you think of clocks and time, we measure out time constantly. We're paid for the amount of work that we do. If you go back to before the first clocks were invented, the only people who really needed to divide the day into specific periods were monks, because they had to have their religious services at regular hours. For everybody else living by the seasons, this sounds really weird, but an hour was not of a specific length. There were 24 hours in a day, but it was divided so that there were 12 hours in the night time and 12 hours when it was daylight, which meant that in the summer, you had far more hours of daylight than you did in the winter, which meant that the hours were much longer. And so hours were different in length, depending on whether it was the winter or the summer. So this concept of equal segments of time was really introduced by the churches when they introduced clocks on their bell towers to tell the monks the time of the services. But those very same clocks also started regulating the society, and they lie at the very basis of economics, because the whole basis of modern capitalism and investment depends on time. So I think that's an excellent example of how modern capitalism emerged from something, a religious process, which we think of as being completely separate from it.
Yeah, I think they're deeply interrelated. And I was talking to Paul Friedman a couple of episodes ago, and I listened to most of his lectures at Yale. What I learned about the Middle Ages, it used to be, and it's a long stretch of time that basically goes from the end of the Roman Empire, the early Roman Empire, say the 4th century. It's still somewhat further in the east. and then it stretches all the way to the Renaissance and then the Enlightenment that comes after. It kind of seems there isn't much happening in scientific knowledge generation. There is a lot happening in human society, and it seems to be this whole Jewish heritage is actually being digested over many generations throughout Europe, and it's being reformed and it's being changed, and eventually it leads to the Reformation. But why do you think it took so long before this Cambrian evolution or revolution came around, with all these scientific discoveries seemingly all fall into a period about 1,000 years after the end of the initial Roman Empire? Why did it take so long? And is there something that we overlook if we want to reproduce this that was put in place shortly before the Enlightenment and that triggered it?
Personally, I don't think there was such a thing as a scientific revolution. I think progress is very slow. If you want to call it progress, change is very slow. There was an awful lot happening in the period that tends to be called the Dark Ages. And the reason that it was called the Dark Ages was the people who came afterwards wanted to relegate that to pretend that nothing had happened, because that makes themselves look better. I mean, it's the same way that the concept of an industrial revolution wasn't invented until the Victorian age, because that made the Victorians look as though they'd achieved something. And the whole concept of a scientific revolution is a very 20th century introduction. It became important in England after the Second World War, when a man called Butterfield, who was a historian at Cambridge, wanted to unify the world through science rather than religion, because he wanted to see the end of war. So the scientific revolution wasn't something that people felt that they were living through. It's a way of dividing history up into convenient chunks that historians have adopted retrospectively. And it's an indication of the rising importance in our society that science has come to hold, that's how we choose to categorize the past. We could have categorized it by great periods of literature, or we could have categorized it by great monarchs or by the Age of Discovery. But what we choose to classify the past by is in terms of scientific development and scientific change, as though it were all leading up to the present, which is absolutely, in my opinion, absolutely not right. Science and society could have taken all sorts of different directions. Indeed, if you look around the world, we can see that different societies have different values and operate in different ways. And it would be very presumptuous of me to think that the UK or America or Anglo-America, whatever you want to call it, the West, is better than everyone else. I mean, it may be different, but that doesn't make it superior.
Yeah, I've been pondering that question. We seem to be almost like a cult that spawned, I don't know, maybe 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago at some point. And I think it's triggered by some Old Testament thinking, but that's all just hypothetical. We came up with this cult of technology, this cult of science, and we kind of split up from the rest of humanity, because even now you can go to lots of places in the world where people live as hunter and gatherers, like in the Stone Age or Bronze Age, and they seemingly are happy, maybe more happy than we are if you ask them. So most of us, we don't want to go back 200 years. I don't think a very small part of the population would go back to the 18th century. We will romanticize it, but we don't actually want to live in that society. There's more diseases and their comfort seems to be low. But lots of people who live in primitive societies today, they're very happy. They don't want to necessarily trade places with us. They kind of want to be left alone. So the question that I always thought about is what happened to us? We elevated science to become, and they now call it, this is very science fiction-y, but people say we are kind of this bootloader, this badware for building intelligent machines that will take over in a couple hundred years, and then they will leave Earth, and that's all science fiction. But do you see there was a specific event that triggered this cult of technology or cult of science?
No, I don't see a specific event. It's a cumulative event, but I think we're in the situation now where science has managed over the last couple of hundred years to put itself into such a powerful position that a lot of people assume that science is a supreme form of knowledge. And collectively, governments are pouring huge amounts of money into science. So at the moment, there's all the different countries are going out to Mars and out to other planets and seeing what they can find there. In my opinion, it would be much better to stop doing that and to spend all the fortunes that are being spent on that scientific research into making people's lives better on Earth. There's an enormous number of poor people, not just in our own continents, but in Africa and Asia. And personally, I think the money would be far better spent on them. And if there's one thing that the COVID pandemic has taught us, is that increasing technology is not necessarily a very good idea.
Yeah, it definitely makes us more vulnerable. That seems one of the really nasty side effects. You know, you think of someone, there's a TV show called Alone, and they put people outside on Vancouver Island and they have to survive on their own. And even the most successful participants make it for, say, 3, 4, 5 months. And that's it. Then they would literally die of starvation. And they're experts at it. They're the best you can find in the whole US or Canada. And it seems to be that was the default. That was the normal way of life not that long ago, and we would have to survive 50, 60 years like this. So it kind of seems it seems for us unimaginable that this would be a position we ever want to be put in, but that was the default position, and most people had a life, right? Obviously less than around 9 billion people, or much smaller numbers. I find that quite stunning. One thing that we really wanted to ask you, now I have the opportunity, we see a lot of knowledge that came from the old Greeks and then was adopted by the Romans, and they seem to be ready to make big scientific discoveries. For some reason, they did, but they never really put like an industrial revolution or pre-industrial revolution in place, right? They didn't build big machinery besides the war machinery. They built aqueducts, but they didn't generate something, I don't know, they didn't build the steam engine, they didn't build cars. Is this something in your research that you found that was holding them back?
No, but the whole notion of holding them back suggests there's one single route towards the future and that you just progress along that route in different ways. Whereas I think scientific discoveries are made because of particular circumstances, and the whole process of change is very, very slow and very cumulative. So, for example, if you take Isaac Newton, we celebrate him for discovering or inventing the laws of gravity and unifying the cosmos. But he didn't do that single-handedly. For the previous 200 years, there'd been other people working on that problem. So Copernicus is the most famous, but then there was someone, Kepler, for example, and Galileo were absolutely crucial to Newton's ideas. But before that, there were people in the medieval universities who were working on new mathematical systems. And you can, whenever you write about someone, you can always, it seems to me, you can always trace a predecessor. So now a lot of people are saying that there were Arabic precursors to Copernicus who put the sun rather than the earth at the center of the universe, and that Copernicus might well have known about their theories. So I'm very much opposed to this concept of one single genius who comes along and revolutionizes everything all on his own, because there's always antecedents and there are also always successors. So again, using the example of Isaac Newton, it took about 100 years before the whole of Europe really accepted all of his ideas, and along the way those ideas changed substantially. So the version of Newtonianism that we have now is very, very different from the one that he held himself. We believe in a deterministic universe, so that in principle, if you know at the moment where everything is and how fast it's moving, you can in principle work out exactly how it's going to be moving in 10,000 years from now. It would be too difficult practically, but in principle you can, because we live in a deterministic universe. Isaac Newton did not suggest a deterministic universe. He suggested a universe that was somehow God. God permeated the universe, and God could intervene in the operations of the universe. God could send in animistic matter in the tails of comets. Newton's God could affect how the universe operates. So that's a fundamental, crucial philosophical difference between the universe that Newton envisaged and the theory that we now call Newtonianism. They're very different.
I find this really interesting that we see almost until the early 20th century, most of the names that we remember, that doesn't mean that they are actually the ones who did all the work, right? But they definitely contributed. And they seem to be really strong believers. Typically, it's New Testament or Old Testament beliefs. So typically it's Catholics, it's Protestants. And I was just reading Hobbes, and half of his book is how the state should look like. It's a political book, right? It's a kind of the secular part. But the second part is of the Leviathan is how do I prove, literally scientific proof for elements and quotes of the New Testament. And I was really blown away by this. So it wasn't something where he had like a scientific distance. He examined it, but he already knew it was 100% true. So he didn't question it, which was amazing to me because he was a political scientist, right? So he wasn't entrenched in technology, but he was definitely entrenched in building the modern state. And that seems to end in the early 20th century. Since then, we have a deeply secular part of the intelligentsia. Most people in modern universities, they wouldn't put the word God anywhere in their white papers or books. Do you think this is a generally good thing, or we're missing out on something? Because it seems for a long time, this was like the staple of science and research, to be very close to God and figure out how God actually works.
I think the reason that science and religion separated in the early 20th century was because there was a tussle for social power between Victorian scientists and Victorian clerics. And it was in both their interests to separate from each other in order that they could each claim authority in a separate sphere. So I think part of the answer of the separation of science and religion is as a consequence of this social struggle for power. I think, in my opinion, scientists have still not answered the fundamental questions that religion is asking. Where did the universe come from? I mean, it's all very well to say that there was a big bang, I don't know how many million years ago, but that still doesn't fundamentally answer the question of what happened before the big bang, or how did everything come to be? What's the difference between me now talking to you and me in some years' time when I'm dead? You can explain it by saying that my spirit has left my body, which scientists wouldn't accept as an explanation. But on the other hand, scientists don't have any viable explanation either. So in that sense, you could say that science has achieved very little in terms of real, true knowledge.
Sometimes I have the same suspicion. And, that is also true for most morals. So science doesn't tell us much about morals. I think we're getting a couple more answers, but they're definitely not widespread knowledge in society yet. Maybe we'll get there over the next 100 years or 200 years. So when you read Plato or Socrates, or we ponder with the same questions, and we don't have any better answers. We kind of have similar answers, but even Aristotle, most people today, if you ask them the same question, they would probably have worse answers than he had, and that's 2,500 years ago.
Well, it's very easy to excuse scientists from having morals. So if you think, for example, of the bombs that the Americans dropped on Hiroshima, a lot of scientists felt very guilty about it, but a lot of scientists basically took the line, well, it was a government decision to drop the bombs, and it was a government decision to tell me to work on the bomb. And so they could absolve themselves of any responsibility of being complicit in this process. But I think it's wrong for scientists to do that. You haven't got two separate worlds, a scientific world and a moral world. Individual people have to make their own decisions about what they're going to work on. And there's a lot of scientists who, before the war and after war, refused to work on something like an atomic bomb. So I don't think science itself can have an ethical code, because I don't think there is such a thing as science. Science is what scientists do, and scientists are people, and there's a lot of them, and collectively they make decisions.
There seems to be a lot of people have different ideas and theories about it. When we talk about morals and the history of science, I think one topic that we always need to talk about is slavery, right? So slavery was deeply immoral, and I think even in the Roman Empire and before, it was the standard modus of operation in many countries. But I think even then, if you read old texts, there was something of a bad conscience was already building. The old Greeks already had a bit of a bad conscience about slavery, and it seems to be strange that, and a lot of people say, well, the Roman Empire never really came up with any technological, labor-saving technology because they had access to this vast amount of slaves from wherever they wanted to hunt new slaves for the empire. I'm not sure if I buy this, but it seems like we only abandoned slavery really widespread and with a strong overtone at a time when the Industrial Revolution ran around and we had labor-saving technology with the steam engine, plenty, and it was relatively cheap. So my question is, does morality and the being a better person, does it follow a certain economics, or is it the other way around? Could we have abandoned slavery, or should have been abandoned slavery? I think we all agree we should. But do you think, given the incentives at the time, it could have happened widespread 2,000 years ago? What would it be necessary to make that happen?
Well, the basic argument in England during the 18th century, which is when the abolition movement started, the basic argument was that the whole British economy depended on the slave trade, and therefore it would be impossible to get rid of it. I mean, that was why abolition took so many years to come. I think there were people then who protested, and they pointed out what is still true now, that every individual has to make their own decisions. So, for example, some people now refuse to buy books from Amazon, or they refuse to buy clothes from certain shops, or they refuse to buy coffee from certain American coffee stores. And each person has to sort of reach a moral decision about what they are going to do and what they aren't going to do. But I think whatever sort of life we live, we can always feel that we're privileged. Certainly in England and America, whatever our lives are, we're privileged compared with other people, but we're not necessarily going to make the decision to sacrifice our own lives in order to help others. And I think the people in the 18th century or earlier in the Roman society, when they thought about slavery, were involved in making those similar sort of decisions. For them, they were not prepared to give up their wealth and their comfort just to save some enslaved people who were very conveniently 2,000 miles across the Atlantic, whereas other people were prepared to take that moral decision, which is why it ended. I think one of the other interesting things about the start of the abolition movement at the end of the 18th century was one of the decisions that was made was to boycott sugar. And the British government made a huge profit by taxing sugar imports, and we were the biggest sugar importer in Europe. And by joining the movement to boycott sugar, it enabled women and people, the very many men who didn't have the vote, to exert political influence because they were the ones that supported the sugar boycott. So I think that's quite an interesting aspect of it, that was, in a way, it was a sort of start of a sort of true 100% universal democracy. It was for the first time women and poorer men could make their opinion felt, and they made it felt where it hurt in government revenues.
Yeah, I just feel it follows a certain economic reality. As you say, it was for the longest time, it was considered unaffordable to get rid of slaves. And then suddenly it was not such a big deal anymore, right? Strange how this happens. And maybe it's a bit like we slaughter all these animals, right? And we feel like without animals, we don't have anything to eat. We could eat other stuff, but we feel like that wouldn't be a life we aspire to. If someone comes up with cheap food that is the same, but we don't have to extract it from live or animals who were alive at some point, then we just change our mind. Becomes it's not too. It doesn't really distract us from our life that we are used to, right? So there seems to be, as you say, there is a cost of morality, and sometimes it's a positive cost. So you really pay for your higher morals, and that's often you put yourself in a shaky situation, I feel, because if the cost is too high, then you just become globally very uncompetitive. Or it's a negative cost. So certain beliefs that I feel, and so that's where I feel religion comes in, it kind of makes it makes it cheaper to live, it makes it more productive to live, so to speak. Cheaper is maybe the wrong word. And before we go there, I think it's we adopt a certain, and we have all this variety of beliefs, but we don't really know how these things will play out because it's a complex human society, right? So we probably only need a certain small amount of people who are very vocal, like what we see right now. Political movements, they're very vocal, and it's only maybe 5 to 10% of the population, but that might be enough to steer the population in a completely different direction.
I think it's also very tempting to assume the moral high ground and to think we're far more ethical than societies were in the past. So when slavery was rampant in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, quite a lot of people didn't actually see a moral problem with it, because many of them thought that that Black Africans, that was what the debate was about, was that Black Africans were far closer to animals than white Europeans. And so they felt that they had the right to own them, just like people nowadays think that they have the right to own either a dog or a horse or a cow to do work for them. And by the time it got to the First World War, slavery, in a way, was still widely practiced in England. There were thousands and thousands and thousands of servants who were effectively in captivity, working for very, very low wages. And the First World War was one of the ways in which women particularly were liberated from that sort of servitude. And there are all sorts of absolutely terrible, awful things happening now. So I do think we're very wrong to assume that we know what the moral high road is. I think that we need far more ethical debate. I think rather like science, I don't think there is a progress from a low ethical standard to a high ethical standard. We just see things differently from how people did in the past. So in both England and America, the societies for the protection of animals were set up about 100 years before the Society for the Protection of Children. And that's because the idea was that you had a responsibility to look after animals. So the moral questions that people were asking themselves were different from the ones that we're asking now. And I don't think we're necessarily any better.
Yeah.
Which
yeah.
There's quite frequently scandals. I mean, this society still does practice slavery, and there's also the people who are working under appalling conditions for very, very low wages. I mean, that is still happening. So we haven't completely eradicated enslavement in the world, even in England and America.
Yeah, when I read Carl Jung, he went out to a lot of primitive societies. He studied them, and some of the habits they strike us as just pure horror. Right?
Sorry. Can I just say something? I don't think you should talk about primitive societies, because that assumes that's a derogatory term that assumes that we are more advanced.
Society that he called primitive. Let's put it this way.
He called primitive.
That's not my
That's
opinion.
fine. That's fine. Sorry.
That's his opinion. And it was the early 20th century, late 19th century. What I found, when you analyze societies that he studied, they don't seem to be less happy. They seem to be, and they have a moral code, right, that's different from ours. And we would see, still look at certain habits and certain customs as kind of horrific, but to them and the way their society works, and maybe the way it reduces violence for them, is something that's quite surprising when you look at some of those. So I fully agree with you. This progress that we are on, it seems it's not clear. The only thing that kind of helps me to often feel we are onto something, and it's not just random, is it's rare that you want to send people from an advanced society, so to speak, right, or from a society that follows a Western model. When you ask most people, would you go back to another society that we consider less advanced, right? Again, that's a judgment. Or would you go back to the 15th century in a different time frame, or even to the 1950s? Most people would say no. And even if you say that 10 years ago, would you go back to society with all the negatives you had 10 years ago? most people would romanticize about it for a while, but they wouldn't go for it. They would actually say, no, right now it's the best society, as voted by most people out there and myself, that we ever had in our lifetimes.
Yeah, but if you,
Beyond
I mean,
that.
you asked me if I would go back to other situations. I mean, I'm not hugely familiar with it. There's a big literature. Akabi is a very good example of people, African writers, who write about the adverse effects that the European missionaries had on their own societies, and how their own African moral codes deteriorated beneath the invasion of Europeans. So I think it's important to ask other people what they think as well. And so, for example, another example is, I think it's very easy for us. We romanticize the past and we romanticize other societies. So when you hear about technophobes bemoaning all the electricity and the cars and the digitization, what they're actually doing is writing all these complaints on a laptop, sitting in a nice centrally heated room. Yeah. And then another thing that people tend to romanticize other societies, and they go abroad, and which I have great problems about doing this, about going abroad and looking at other societies and sort of gawping at them as though they were in sort of some sort of human zoo. But the people in those societies, if you offer them, I don't know, mobile telephones or drip dry shirts, they seize them with great alacrity. They don't want to be preserved in that state that they are now. So I think we've got to be very careful about making sure we collect everybody's opinions and not just pronounce from our alleged position of superiority.
Western ideology is an invasive species. Yeah. There's a lot of places. I went to 130 different countries, and that's kind of my first question. How do we compare, and what's this unique gift that particular culture or place has? And every single place has one. Sometimes it takes a while to find it, so it's not always an easy discovery. And obviously it comes from my own mindset, right? So what's unique for me is not the same for another person or someone who lives there. But, and I think goes to your theory, I feel what we've lost out in a lot of technological progress over the years, we've lost out in happiness. The amount of anxiety we have to live with, the amount of negative emotions that is in everyone's brain, especially now with COVID. It's a big price that we pay for all this technological progress over the centuries. And that's, if you go outside Western culture, the picture is different. Often you see a lot of poor countries, they're very joyful. They are actually the ones, from my anecdotal evidence, where you see the most joy. Even if there's danger, if there's a lot of violence, the joy in people's eyes that you can feel in that moment, and it's repetitive, it repeats over the day. It's not just a single moment. Is astonishing compared to this. I mean, here in San Francisco, everyone looks to the ground. Nobody looks into people's eyes. Nobody talks to anyone. Everyone has masks and visors on, and you're like, whoa, this is a special situation now. But that was something building for a longer time that made people so depressed.
But I mean, again, you're sort of seeing it from the outside. I mean, you're sort of romanticizing other societies. You're saying that there's a certain sort of joyfulness. I mean, I can switch on the television and I look at a famine in Ethiopia, and there's no joy in those people's eyes. And if other societies are so joyful, why is it that thousands and thousands and thousands of refugees are willing to risk death in order to come to Western Europe and to America? So I think this romanticization. So
I would do badly in a debate with you. I'm glad we're not in a debate. So, one thing I wanted to ask you about, and that's more back to the scientific progress we've seen over such a long time. We used to have this age of the polymath, and that seemed to be strongly something we've seen in the 17th, 18th century, at least the people that we can remember. Do you think it will ever come back? We will go to, a lot of people say this about, Musk, because he has all these companies, very different parts of technological development. Do you think we will see more of this in the near future?
Well, the move into scientific disciplines didn't really start until the 19th century. So I think when you go back to the 17th, 18th century or earlier, I mean, everybody was, by our standards, everyone was a polymath because the whole map of knowledge was divided up completely differently. So there wasn't really science in the sense that we mean science. What they called science was a formalized knowledge that you put in books. So you could have the science of history or the science of language, for example. And so the whole way that everything was thought about was completely different. And there were also some very, very narrow specialists. If you think of Middlemarch and Casaubon going back into his history of the past, he just had a very, very narrow tunnel vision, and I think the same is true now. And there's still people on television, radio, broadcasters who have a sort of smattering, have a good, it's either a smattering of lots and lots and lots of different disciplines, but they also have the skill of being able to bring it all together. And then there's other people who specialize in some very, very narrow topic, whether it's medieval coins or whether it's cell structures. They bore down and do things more deeply. So I don't think that's really changed. What has changed is just the way we divide up knowledge into different sections.
But it seems these polymaths really sped up technological or scientific progress for a little bit. They made discoveries that we attribute to them. That's probably lower layers of technology and science they relied on. But when we look back to 17th, 18th century, they seem to be all polymaths. And now there's like rarely someone that we see that has the same stature in science, so to speak. And it's really difficult even for mathematicians to break into physics and vice versa. Although from my point of view, they're extremely related.
It is. The knowledge becomes very specialized. On the other hand, it's quite interesting that some people who make great breakthroughs come from a completely different discipline. So one very good example is Alfred Wegener, who is now celebrated as the person who invented the theory of continental drift. And he suggested that in about 1910, something like that. And the reason that he could do that was because he was a meteorologist and he wasn't too stuck in his own discipline. He could sort of see everything from the outside. And I think that happens quite often. And another thing that's happening now is that the disciplines that we all recognized in the past are all coming together. They're all being reformed. So there's specialities of medical physics, and there's a new speciality of reproductive sciences that brings together anthropologists and biologists and all sorts of different disciplines. So all the separate disciplines, they're constantly merging and redefining themselves.
Do you think, and maybe by doing this and having slightly different approaches to science, is there a way to speed up and control, so to speak, the technological progress? Or is that something that happens with or without us? We really have no control over that.
Well, the government is constantly trying to exert control, and now scientists spend an awful lot of their time filling out application forms for research funding. And there's this strange situation that in order to get funding for a particular research topic, you more or less have to know what you're going to have to find in advance. I mean, nobody is going to get funding for a project that says, well, I just want to go out and see what happens, and it might fail and it might work. Governments will only fund research that's more or less guaranteed to produce results. And if you think of the discovery of DNA, when James Watson and Francis Crick were trying to build their model of DNA, they were both PhD students who were meant to be doing something completely different. And if they were behaving like that nowadays, their supervisor would just forbid all the experiments they were carrying out, because they'd only have 3 years from beginning to end to get their PhD done, and they wouldn't have had time to do all this other research. And presumably the structure of DNA would have, well, Rosalind Franklin would have worked it out for a start. But it's a very good example of how if you if you focus down too narrowly and you steer people in advance, you're never going to find out anything by accident, by chance. You're never going to go in a different direction. It's very counterproductive, government policy.
A lot of people say we should do that differently. You should just literally take a bucket of money, throw them at basic research, don't really have a lot of expectations at the outset. And I think we've done this before, right? But the problem always is it ends up as a Soviet bureaucracy. All these layers of management, and there's a few researchers, and most of them, they kind of give up at some point. Some are just naturally curious. I'm not saying there's nothing that will come out of it. But you see the structure of 5,000 people, and you feel from the outside, obviously it's different from the inside, there's only like 50 people who actually work on something useful. And that's from when we look at this from a company perspective, that seems really odd, right? We feel like, oh, we're wasting most of our money, which is like venture capital. You waste 95% of your capital, but you only have 1 or 2 startups that make it, and that's good enough to pay it back. That's how outsized the returns are. And maybe a lot of people argue that on one hand that the state or the public should adopt more of a venture capital model, that we just basically just spray a lot of money and then pray for the best, and hopefully that's enough. We don't have any attachments to it. Basically just give people equity and hope for the best. Do you think that would be a better approach?
Might be. In the past, that was in a way what was happening, because most, not all, but most of the people who made what we now call the great scientific discoveries, most of them were independently wealthy, so they didn't have to worry too much. They could afford to pursue their own interests and spend as much time as they wanted to in doing that. So I don't think there's any real evidence that this very, very directed and controlled scientific research is producing as good results. So yes, just throw all your money at it and see what happens might well be a good idea. But I think it's very unlikely that any government would agree to do that. They'd be accused by the taxpayers of being incredibly irresponsible. So it's very unlikely.
Yeah, and you only know afterwards what worked, right? So for the longest time, say for 5 or 10 years, I was involved with a vehicle that is a bit like a public VC in Germany. And they kind of had this big ideas, and then every year they cut down on it quite a bit, because exactly the public, what's going on there. And they never had any exit. And I think they were like 200 to 300 million in. So it was a considerable amount of money. And they were really stressing out, and they were cutting funding to most of the existing investments. And then, you know what? 5 years later, they made a $3 billion exit, and everyone's happy. But for the longest time, it looked like a complete failure. So this time horizon is a real problem, right? You have to wait at least 10 years. And that's a long time for being in the public limelight. And, most administrations around 4 years, so it's a really short time. Doing a 10-year investment is ridiculous. I mean, that doesn't sound very natural.
But COVID's another example of how, when there is a specific problem to solve and you put resources into it, it gets solved quite rapidly. But perhaps that's because medical research is rather different from open-ended scientific research. The medical researchers were looking for a very specific vaccine, which is rather different from sitting back and, for example, trying to work out how you could make relativity and quantum mechanics compatible, because there is a great rift down the middle of physics, which has not been resolved. And I don't know if anybody's working on that problem, but that seems to me a great difficulty in physics. And rather like Einstein and relativity in 1905, it seems to me quite possible that the whole foundation of physics could just topple.
I have the same impression, but when I talk to people who know something or know a lot about that subject, they've all kind of given up on anything that moves beyond light speed, for instance. So it's just they kind of accept that by now, even in thousands of years, we can't overcome this, which is, for me, seems a bit like, the Wright brothers. They knew it could be done, but it wasn't. They looked at, I don't know, 10,000 years of history of where it couldn't be done, and then suddenly it worked, right? So I feel like we are in the same paradigm there of quantum physics, but
it's very difficult.
I'm still very hopeful. Let's put it this way, but it's unrealistic. But I don't have any reason to be hopeful besides being hopeful. I think that's one of those things I learned. You got to create this hopefulness and this optimism first. Otherwise, you don't get anywhere. I mean, you might get, you see the world through too much of a pink light And that might be a problem on its own. But if you don't have that, if you just stay inside your comfort zone, then the self-fulfilling prophecy will never get going, and we will never get anywhere.
Yeah, but that sort of attitude is promoted by the current regime, because if you produce results that completely contradict everything else, you're very unlikely to get funding for it. But that's what somebody's got to do in order to solve this basic problem of the disparity between relativity and quantum mechanics.
Yeah, that's why we need our billionaires. Hopefully they find that niche and invest into it.
So there's so many scientists have got so much invested in maintaining. I mean, if you've been doing, for example, quantum mechanics for your whole life, and you've predicted new particles and you've found new particles based on quantum mechanics, you're going to be very, very reluctant to support any research proposal that suggests turning that completely in a different direction. I mean, you're going to be opposed to it. So it's very difficult to break into that and change it.
Yeah, we definitely need this permissionless environment. Like I obviously want that for entrepreneurs in most parts of the economy, but we also definitely need that in science. And it is always a problem with the incumbent. I want to steer our conversation a little bit more to Isaac Newton. And I know you found some really interesting stuff about Isaac Newton. And I think your book is primarily about his later years in life when he worked at the London Mint. Why did you select that time frame?
Why did I choose it? Was that the question?
Sorry. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Why did I choose that time frame? Well, because Isaac Newton has been mythologized as the man who supposedly sat underneath an apple tree in his country garden. And then at Cambridge, he's represented as a reclusive scholar who divorced himself from the world and discovered the great theory of gravity. But although biographers have written about the last 30 years of his life, nobody else except me has ever focused specifically on what he was doing then. He lived in London for 31 years, which is a very long time. He was an extremely influential man. He was for much of that time, he was Master of the Royal Mint, which is a position roughly equivalent to being the governor of the Bank of England nowadays. And I just wanted to present an interpretation of Newton that differed from the conventional one. It's not that I found out lots of new facts about him. Most of the research had already been done, but a lot of physicists, when they write biographies of Newton, have their own lives invested in presenting him as a supreme scientist. Their whole scientific careers have been in following science, and so they set up Isaac Newton as a great hero on a pedestal. It's almost as though they worship him. So they've got an enormous amount invested in presenting him as being a very virtuous and very heroic sort of character. I don't have that sort of investment, that sort of personal investment in preserving Isaac Newton's reputation. And so I just wanted to represent him as I see him in the last 30 years of his life, when he was very influential, he was very rich, he seems to have behaved very, very badly towards some people. And I thought that would be a more realistic portrayal of him, rather than the alchemist who never spoke to anybody and was very reclusive. It's quite clear that however he behaved in Cambridge, he was very different when he went down to London. And he wanted to go to London. That last part of his career is quite often presented as a great scientific mind who, out of the goodness of his heart, was giving the benefit of his brain to running the economy, and was seen as being a pretty petty sort of task. But it wasn't like that at all. He was trying for 2 or 3 years to get out of Cambridge. He couldn't wait to get down to London. When the job was offered to him, he took the next stagecoach down and stayed there for the next 30 years. He wanted to do it.
When I looked at Isaac Newton, one thing that I realized is that he has a very tormented childhood. His mother kind of rejected him. She went on to start a new family. He grew up with his grandparents. Eventually, she came back. And he seemed to be definitely a child that was in limbo and probably felt that.
We only have Isaac. Well, basically, we have Isaac Newton's interpretation of his childhood. I think a lot of people present their particular childhood as being very tough. What happened was that his father died before he was born, And then when he was 3 years old, his mother remarried and they went to live somewhere else. And they did. They left Isaac Newton with his grandmother. A lot of children, especially then, were brought up with grandparents. Isaac Newton presented himself as being a tortured child, and it's quite easy to make a sort of Freudian interpretation. He left notebooks that he made when he was in Cambridge about how he hated his stepfather and he wanted to burn down the house that he lived in and all the other children and his mother with them. But certainly the period that I've looked at, there's plenty of evidence that he was very close to his family. His step niece lived with him for many, many years in London and looked after him. He was with his mother when she died. He gave large amounts of money to all the members of his family, and he stayed with them and he wrote to them and he supported them, and he went back to Woolsthorpe at regular periods. So I'm not sure that he had such a terrible childhood as you're making out. I mean, I imagine he was upset at being separated from his mother, but that's a bit different from having a terrible childhood.
This definitely a trait to rewrite our history, and you know way more about the actual facts. What I was trying to bring into the conversation is, do we need that rejection? Do we need this rupture in our life, especially early in our childhood? And we see this from a lot of successful people, that they had somewhat convoluted childhoods. Maybe they made up these problems later on. So this could be another theory. But when we look at problems we have in today's society, it seems to be we err on the side of coddling our children too much. We worry about them all the time. We see them as precious investments that we like a vase that we shouldn't take outside. It should be in a museum and should be perfect, but it definitely should not interact with reality, should definitely not interact with danger. But for a lot of people who are very successful, it seems they have, at least retroactively, they had a tough childhood, so to speak. There was something that made them realize you got to survive on your own, and you got to have that drive, or you're in trouble. Is that something you've seen before, or that's just some people are like that, and some people have just a happy childhood and they still turn out to be genius?
I think one thing that's difficult to assess is what's going to happen in the future. I think you're absolutely right that the modern attitude is to protect children, overprotect children, and I saw that a lot in my role as a university teacher, because a lot of the students that I was seeing had absolutely no experience whatsoever of looking after themselves. A lot of them had never even taken a bus or a train to school. They'd always been driven, and they found it very, very difficult suddenly being launched into an independent life. And a lot of them, as a consequence, had very difficult experiences when they were at university. And of course, those people, that generation, has not yet lived through an age where we will know whether what the results of that particular experience of childhood were. I think it's easy. Most people can create a difficult childhood for themselves if they want to. I certainly could, whereas looking from the outside, I had a perfectly comfortable, normal childhood. But I think certainly when I was a teenager, I could present myself as being very hard done by. So I think it's all sort of part of the romantic myth. On the other hand, you think of someone like Robert Maxwell, for example, who certainly did have a very hard childhood. He was wandering across Europe by himself when he was a teenager, and he turned into an extremely, extremely successful man, but he was an extremely unpleasant one as well. So perhaps that's part of what goes with it. I don't know. But it's very tempting to take a few extreme cases like that and generalize from them. I think you'd have to do a much, much more carefully controlled experiment, which is why I said it's important to wait to see what this helicopter generation turns into. They'll probably end up being as successful as everybody else.
It seems to be we don't really have a conscious moment where we trace back our drive that drove us to a certain excellence at that moment, right? So the excellence obviously defined against our contemporaries very often. We don't compare ourselves to someone 500 years ago or 500 years in the future because we can't, right? So we compare ourselves in excellence and all these things against contemporaries. And there seems to be something, and I don't know if it's more nature or it's nurture or it's some accident, what plays that role that certain people will go out of their comfort zone, risk a lot, and usually this risk, I mean, there's really dumb risk. Like you can drive 100 miles through a crowded city and you kill yourself and others. That's a really dumb risk. But say a calculated risk that seems to have way more on the upside than it has on the downside, and then make the world a better place, because in these risky things, like a risky experiment or a risky new opinion that you put out there or a book that you write, you make the world a better place because it helps everyone to they don't have to take that risk, but they get the same outcome that you found, right? So it makes everyone better off. It's kind of like a big investment. That's also a big risk. And I always found it really interesting to see what gave us this initial drive to get there. I don't have a lot. I have a lot of ideas and theories. None of them really explain it.
Well, the UK has got two national heroes. One's Isaac Newton and the other is William Shakespeare. And William Shakespeare took a lot of risks in his life. He left Stratford and he went to London, where it was very risky. And he set himself up in business as a playwright, which was a very, very difficult way of earning your living. And he was extremely successful at it, as you know. And as far as I'm aware, he had quite an ordinary childhood. I mean, his father was the mayor of Stratford. He made gloves. So it was, as far as I'm aware, it was quite a normal, sort of reasonable childhood. And, you know, he took the risks and he was successful. So he would be a good counterexample
Yes.
to your proposition.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's definitely not just the childhood. You're right, but maybe it's events in our childhood we don't even remember. You know, there was this theory for a while with like post-traumatic issues that we have from things that happened when we were a year or 2 years old. So we don't remember them consciously, but they kind of haunt us the rest of our life.
Yeah, well, you can suppose that. That's a very easy thing to suppose, that perhaps, yes, that you might have had a traumatic event that you don't remember, but that's easy to say. I mean, you can't prove whether that's true or not. I mean,
right. Yes.
I mean, you can argue anything on that basis.
It's not so helpful. One thing about Newton that I had no idea about, I just learned about that with your help, is he was really worried and opposed to the standard theory at the time of Holy Trinity, right? That's how the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost, how they interact with each other. There was a lot of debate in the early days of Christianity about that. And I think there's still a lot of Christian that have slightly different ideas how this actually works. The role of those three is it's not very logical, let's put it this way, what the actual creed came up with, but it actually became part of the Catholic Church. And I think it's kind of forgotten, this discussion. But what was Newton's problem with it?
So Newton was a great peruser of ancient documents, and he came to the conclusion that it was called a heresy. It's the Arian heresy, named after the person who proposed it. Was a very early idea, and it's basically, as you said, there's not God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, but specifically that Jesus is not a holy person, that Jesus was an ordinary person. He is not divine. And that belief has led on to form the Unitarian Church, but that didn't exist in Isaac Newton's time. And then if you wanted to be a fellow of an Oxford or Cambridge college, you had to be a member of the Church of England. You couldn't be Catholic. You couldn't be Jewish, you couldn't be a Quaker, you had to subscribe to the Church of England. And there's a creed called the 39 Articles. And one of the items in that is to believe in the Holy Trinity. And Isaac Newton refused to do that. He somehow managed to get a special dispensation from the king. So he was allowed to be a fellow at Trinity, even though very, very unusually, he hadn't made that declaration. When he stopped being the Lucasian professor, he ensured that the next Lucasian professor was a man called William Whiston, who was his protege and who was a great admirer of Newton's mathematics. William Whiston rather foolishly advocated Arianism, but he also proselytized, and he tried to persuade other people to adopt it as well. And after a few years, he was banished from Cambridge, and he had to go down to London and try and earn his living as a lecturer. Newton was far more canny about it, and he kept very, very, very quiet about this belief, because he would have run into enormous problems at Cambridge and elsewhere if he'd been very open about the fact that he was an Arian.
It strikes me, looking back, and there's probably way more examples, but it strikes me as almost incredible that unbelievable that these really small differences in early Christianity created so much division, so much debate, at least, and it took so long to resolve them.
Well, you say it's a small difference, but if you're Christian, it's an enormous difference. I mean, it's far more of a difference than, say, the difference between Catholicism and Anglicanism. Or Protestantism. I mean, it's a huge difference whether or not you believe that Jesus is divine. I mean, it's like the difference between Christianity and Judaism, basically.
Yes, but you have the same testament, right? You typically accept the same canon. So you look at the same New Testament, and yes, you can interpret it differently, and especially the Holy Trinity, because it's not so well defined in the text itself. It opens itself up to a lot of different interpretations. It's not nobody really literally writes enough about it. So then there's lots of other traditions of Christianity that we have today that are not very well formed in the New Testament. They don't happen there at all, which is really strange to me.
Well, I mean, it doesn't matter to me personally, because I don't have a religion. But if you are a religious person, those sort of questions are absolutely crucial. I mean, they're the sort of questions that people went to the stake for. And they don't now, but our society has changed, and I don't think these questions are unimportant. I mean, if people attach such great importance to them, then they are important by definition. And just because people did in the past and don't now doesn't mean that they're trivial. Yeah.
When we look at the influence that religion has on this technological progress, what is your discovery or your gut feeling? And then that would be part number one. And part number two is, where do you see the most exciting areas of technological progress right now? Not necessarily in what kind of technology, but in what localities, what countries, or what is the determining factors where you see those might be the most, I don't want to say progressive, but what are the most successful, most likely candidates for coming up with great discoveries?
I don't know a huge amount about this field, but it seems to me the most exciting potential lies in looking at the natural world and emulating life forms or life processes and adapting them technologically, rather than repeatedly trying to come up with new technological advances. Can I tell you again about the slime molds?
Yes, please.
Yes, okay.
I love that story.
Okay, so as just one example of something that I do know quite a lot about, there's some strange organisms called slime molds, and they're not animals, and they're not plants, and they're not fungi. They live in a separate kingdom called Patrica, and there's lots of different kinds, but there's one kind in particular that apparently they seem to behave intelligently. So if you take a little blob of this slime mold, they're minute, tiny organisms, and you put some in the center of a maze, and then you put some food outside the maze. The slime mold can crawl through the maze systematically and arrive at the food. It's as though the slime mold had a memory, and as though the slime mold were making decisions intelligently. And there was a key experiment was carried out in Tokyo, where a group of Japanese researchers got a map of Tokyo and the surrounding area, and they put some slime mold over the place where Tokyo was placed, and then they put little bits of oat flake. Apparently slime molds love oat flake. They put oat flakes on all the major cities around Tokyo, and then they watched what happened over the next 24 hours. And all the tiny, tiny organisms amalgamated together into one giant cell. And they sent out little tendrils, little filaments towards these pieces of food. And they started off by sending them uniformly, but very soon they developed some sort of way of finding out which were productive or useful paths to take and which were unproductive. And after the 26 hours of the experiment were up, they established a network of filaments that very closely resembled the existing railway network that had been designed by human engineers to take goods efficiently from Tokyo to the surrounding cities. And very many similar sorts of experiments have been carried out. There have been slime molds have done maps of the American highways. They've done similar experiments in Britain. And the latest research that I heard about was that the decision-making process that they use, which is not a logical, a binary decision like digital computers use, it's a different form of decision-making, that computer programmers have absorbed that mode of decision-making into algorithms that are investigating the cosmic dark web and are doing useful things like maximizing network transport systems and taking advantage of this different way of thinking. So I think when you look at the natural world, how these slime molds operate, it makes you think, well, what does it mean to think? And so I know that there are many other examples where people have looked at the natural world and it's led them to think differently about communication and our own interactions with the natural world.
There seems to be a lot of magic left, right, in nature. A lot of stuff we can't explain. And
yes,
this is one of those crazy examples. I love this story, and it's some neural network that it's in a decision-making algorithm. It's something we would describe as very primitive. Probably it is. From from one perspective, from another, it is the opposite, right? It's super advanced.
Well, another thing that they've done is they've very closely studied the passage of fluid in these little tendrils and they've worked out how it is that the tendrils are controlled, and it's a system of fluctuating pressures. And now the next step is that they hope that they're going to somehow be able to absorb the same procedure in soft robots that operate underwater. So it's just a different way of thinking about the problem. And if you think about it, there's been millions and millions and millions of years of evolution, and all the natural organisms have come up with some very ingenious solutions to difficult questions. And I think human beings could take advantage of that and learn from it by looking at the natural world. And I know there's a lot of other examples. I'm just not very familiar with what they are.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. Have you ever read the book Intelligent Design? There's been a couple that came after that, but that was one of the early ones.
I haven't read that one.
It is an intelligent creator, not necessarily God, can be God, but something that kind of instituted that algorithm, because there's such a beauty in it. There's such a poetic beauty. There's such an efficiency. It's almost like there is a super intelligent. When you read code, like if you're a coder like me, if you read computer code, you can see not just if it works, but you can see the efficiency, and you can also see a certain style. You can see a beauty in it. And a lot of people assume that's obviously very subjective. There's nothing you can actually put in an objective criteria right now. But there's other computing issues. But that's how a lot of these solutions, when we first see them, and it might be just because we are not really enlightened enough, we feel that it's this beauty in these solutions, and it seems so. How do I say that? It seems so not just computational. The statistics don't really suggest that this is all just random. It just doesn't look random to us. Now, this is very subjective, right? But when I read this book, I'm like, whoa, this is just such a different approach to how evolution was assisted. Evolution still exists, but how evolution was assisted by something or someone. Okay,
so there's some very basic questions I would ask any intelligent designer. Why is it that you designed human eyes in the way that you have, that they're almost bound to fail, often from birth? And why is it that you designed human backs? Like you have so many people suffer from acute back pains. I think those are two very simple questions which make me think that if there is some sort of supreme designer, it isn't very intelligent, or at least not very compassionate.
Yeah, well, you can say that about God and suffering. Excuse me. There seems to be an amount of suffering, and if we have a benevolent God, how can he allow so much suffering? That seems counterproductive, but maybe it isn't, right? Maybe that's what makes us a better human. But yeah, well, that's just a tale we tell us.
I don't want to get into a theological argument with it, but that problem of evil and suffering for me is one of the strongest reasons why I can't possibly believe in a God, Christian or any other sort of God, because it was a big problem. Leibniz wrote a lot about this problem. It's just unbelievable to me that people can jump through so many hoops trying to explain away why suffering makes us better people. I don't think there's any evidence that suffering makes you a better person. I think it makes you a nastier person. And I can't believe that a merciful God lets such suffering happen.
Yeah, there's I think one book in the Bible that just talks about that. Excuse me. Where someone makes exactly that claim and basically talks to God, and God actually talks back and indirectly, and that's quite a debate. And I think the Talmud is full of these things, right? Where you basically take something that is defined and you go through a long logical process, you come out on the other side, and it's almost the opposite of what the initial argument was. I think there's something to it. Maybe that's all we need in order to become a better person. I wanted to go into two more things that I found really fascinating that I learned about you. One is you are president of the Antiquarian Horological Society. So I had to look that up. I have never heard those words before. And I realized it's about timekeeping, right? So it's the science of how time was kept over the centuries. What did you learn from that endeavor?
Well, I was absolutely delighted and very, very surprised when I was invited to become president. And I am very interested in the concept of time. I'm not particularly interested in clocks, which is the sort of mechanical aspect of horology, although my PhD was on magnetism in the 18th century, and I spent a lot of that learning about magnetic compasses and the details of those, and that's quite related to the internal mechanisms of clocks. So what's happened since I've become the president is I've been to a lot of meetings and heard a lot of interesting talks. I've also met a large group of people whom I would never have encountered otherwise, who are so enthusiastic about the watches and the clocks that they studied, and are so knowledgeable that I find that quite inspiring. And there's a regular quarterly journal that comes out, which has wonderful illustrations in. And one of the things that I've been doing for the last year or two is I contribute a short article, about 1,000 words, looking at a different picture every time and talking about how time is incorporated within the picture. Because I find it very interesting, the idea that if you've got a flat, two-dimensional piece of paper which exists in space, how is it that you can show the concept of passing time on a two-dimensional surface? So one of the most famous pictures that addresses that problem is Dice's picture of Pegwell Bay, which shows a small cove with very steep cliffs around it, and it's a Victorian picture. And his family is on the beach gathering fossils. Well, fossils are already about the ancient world. The cliffs show all the geological strata. This was just about the time that Darwin and Charles Lyell was speculating about the age of the Earth, that it might be longer than 6,000 years. And there's a very specific date on the picture in 1858. I can't remember the day, but it's in 1858. And actually, he painted that picture the year before. And the reason he dated it 1858 was because in 1858 there was a big comet called Donati's Comet. And so he repainted the picture as though it were on the day of Donati's comet, and he showed Donati's comet sailing down across the sky. And that particular cove, Pegwell's Bay, was where apparently St. Augustine landed and converted Britain to Christianity. So there's an equation between Donati's comet in the sky and the star that was seen over the stable in Bethlehem when Christ was born. And there's all sorts of other implications of time in it. So every 3 months, I've looked at a different picture and I've told stories like that about how they represent time. And I found that something very interesting to do.
I think even when we learn Einstein's theories and the relativity of time, it's something that's hard for us. I know physicists have an easy time doing this, but I think for anyone who's not in that field of study, seeing how time is not constant is a really weird concept, right? It's something that took me forever to wrap my mind around, and I still have to kind of go into the sphere to like learn it all over again and prepare myself for it. It's something we are so wedded to, that there is this constant stream of time. It's not reversible, and it's the same everywhere where we go in the universe, irrespective of our speed. Is there something where you feel we haven't really gotten anywhere with modifying time, right? So time is still very constant to us. We have observations and we know that Einstein's theories are all correct. But do you think there is something coming for us where we are becoming better at modifying time, the time stream? Is there people, and I know it's science fiction right now, do you feel there's something coming in that direction? There's some actual research being done that we are able to play with time as a constant and change it the way we want?
But I think there's a big difference between time as a scientific quantitative concept that's marked out by clocks, and on the one hand, and then there's the other hand, experiential time, how we personally feel the passing of time. Yeah. And I think, they're obviously related, but they're also very different. And I think our experiential relationship with time is something that I find extremely interesting. Like we were talking earlier about before clocks were invented, people lived by the seasons, and they also lived by sunlight. So they didn't divide the day into equal blocks of time. They divided the day into sunlight and darkness, which is a very, very different way of experiencing the world.
I'm amazed when I go to Ethiopia, their day starts at 6 a.m. at sunrise. It's relatively stable in Ethiopia, and so they tell time differently in terms of, it's still 24 hours, obviously, but it is, so 1 a.m. would be 7 a.m. and it's really confusing. If you try to meet with someone in Ethiopia, you will have trouble figuring out what time are you actually using. It's one of those few countries that I came across that has a very different concept of time.
It's the different concept. There's also different ways of setting up the calendar. So I think it was until the 1940s, Russia was about 12 or 15 days behind us in the calendar. Yeah. And we changed our calendar in 1750 something or other. So that's another aspect of it that I find quite interesting. I once read a story, I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, that here, if you want to catch a bus, you look up the timetable and you go to the bus stop, and when the bus comes, you get on it, because it always comes at a particular time. And then in some countries, the idea is that you go to the bus stop, and when there's enough people at the bus stop, a bus comes and everybody gets on the bus. And it's a different way of thinking about time. It's a very environmental way of thinking about it as well, that you don't send an empty bus down the road. And this idea that money is time, that supposedly Benjamin Franklin coined the phrase, that's only during the last few centuries that's been true. It wasn't true in the past. So people had a very different relationship with time, I think.
Yeah, I think we really feel this if we leave the Western world, right? If we go somewhere else. And someone was telling me about Brazil, and the idea is literally you say you have a problem in your house and you call a plumber. It might take a few weeks until that person actually shows up, and when they show up, they want to create a relationship with you. They want to be your friends. They want you to be invited for drinks, and then they might fix it, or they might not, and come back a couple of weeks later, and you're like, whoa, shouldn't that be done? You know, when the appointment is, and but this is all not relevant. So this is the same will be with our technology. I think we're on some strange arc there, just a part. Our little cult of technology has driven us there. One more thing I wanted to talk about. I know your time is very valuable. You have this really amazing new thing you're working on, and you look at caricatures about science, kind of like the comics of science. And for me, this is just such a marvelous idea, because it transports certain human recognition about what science and how it felt in that moment to the people who actually were involved at that time. And it makes it so much more understandable for a bigger part of the population who doesn't have the time to read scientific books, and who maybe doesn't have the prerequisite knowledge and language. How deep is that field of study? How many things could you look at? How many caricatures are there?
Oh, there's hundreds and hundreds of caricatures. The great age of caricature in Britain was really the 18th and the 19th centuries. I think now when we look at cartoons of science, they're quite often, they're either making a gentle joke, or else cartoon strips are used to teach science. But that certainly wasn't true in the 18th and 19th centuries. Caricatures and cartoons were used to attack science and question it and challenge it. And to look at a caricature by someone like Gilray, for example, who's our most famous caricaturist, they're always very, very complicated. And although they would have seemed immediately very funny to people at the time, they've got a lot of historical references in them, which are quite difficult for us now to tease out. So what I'd really like to do is write a book where there's a caricature, and then on the opposite page, there's a text explaining all the different things that are going on in the caricature and the point that's being made. So one of them, for example, which is particularly relevant now, is we think of smallpox vaccination as being absolutely wonderful. In fact, smallpox has been practically eradicated from the world. But when smallpox vaccination was first introduced, people were very, very skeptical. And with justification. It hadn't been tested properly. There was a lot of secondary infection. The vaccine was derived from cows, and people were very suspicious about that. And there's a marvelous caricature by Gilray of Dr. Jenner, who introduced smallpox vaccination, and it shows his patients lining up, and they've all got horns sprouting out of their heads, and they're all turning into cows, and there's various other aspects to it as well. But it's a very powerful demonstration of anti-scientific feeling, and also how a certain cautious skepticism about science can be justified. In retrospect, smallpox vaccination was an extremely, extremely good idea, but at the time it wasn't nearly so safe, and people were uncertain, and there were a lot of quack remedies being suggested. So I think people are right to be cautious. But it seems to me that it would be such a fun way to learn about the history of science, because you get to look at the caricature and you start to understand it, and you laugh at it.
It's an underrated art form, I feel. We don't see enough of it. There is always this slight bend towards cynicism, which is probably not ideal, and to negativity. But I think it's such a strong medium. It explains itself so quickly. People don't have enough of this, I feel.
I think it does explain itself quickly, but there's a very large number of references in these things. So it's a bit like now, if you watch a satirical news program, they can be absolutely hilarious, but you really have to be up to date with all the news details in order to understand them properly. Otherwise, the jokes slide past you. And I think that's what's happened with these caricatures. People don't know all the details anymore, but they're quite easy to explain, and I think very interesting. So I'd love to do a book about that.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. I'm really excited to read that one. And thank you for doing this, Patricia. That was awesome. Really appreciate it.
Okay, well, thank you very much for taking the time to interview me. Is there going to be a sort of podcast or something? You're going to send me a link?
Yes, it will be a podcast, and it will be on YouTube as well.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. It's very nice to have met you.
Patricia, thank you. Same here.
Okay.
Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye.